My first and only encounter with ghosts happened because I called Louise Pilkerman Lousy Pilkerman right in front of the class. I hadn't meant to, not at all. A month before it happened, our teacher, Mrs. Dandridge, had told us that we were going on an end-of-the-year field trip. Already great news in my book. I loved how weird it felt to walk along in a herd with my friends, taking in the sights of a place I probably wouldn't have been able to visit normally. "And this is going to be a special trip," she continued, grinning like Firuza Balk. "This year, we're going to Rovesford Hotel and we're going to be staying the night." That gave me the shakes. For those of you who don't know, Rovesford is one of the premier weird landmarks in New England. Look it up. There's rarely a top 10 list that doesn't at least mention it, and the discussions about the life and death of its chief architect, the original manager, Emil Rovesford, are still as strong today as they were back then. To put it succinctly, Rovesford is kind of like the Winchester Mystery House on psychedelics, and it is well known for being haunted. I wasn't a fan of ghosts, but I was a fan of weird houses and architectural novelties, so I was over the moon. We had 3 weeks before we were going to go, which was 3 whole weeks in which to catastrophize and worry myself sick. With nightmares about getting hurt and missing the trip, or getting there and finding out it wasn't as cool or interesting as I had built it up to be, growing in frequency and severity. The night before I had a nightmare and then decided to read until I felt better, which ended up being all night, so I wasn't fully awake or aware by the time I actually got into class. I think I sat in the wrong seat and nearly fell on my face before Miss Dandridge had even gotten there. When she did get in, she picked me for roll call. I think to try and make me wake up a bit more. God bless her. And I did well with the first few names, but then I got to Louise and something in my brain, some process, stuttered and I said, "Lousy." Louise Pilkerman was the scariest girl in school, at least to me. She was taller than average, tall and stocky, with big hands, bad acne, greasy hair, and chapped lips that never seemed to smile, even a little bit. Other boys said that her parents were both alcoholic redneck bikers who were always in and out of jail. They were actually both in the military and were very proud of having spotless records, and that Louise was a thug who sold dope to other kids. She was certainly free with her fists, but she never so much as got a glare from a cop, as far as I know, and later on in high school, she'd get the cops called on someone who was selling drugs. So I was terrified of her. I was small, skinny, and awkward, and she seemed to radiate this cold anger like a wall that knocked everyone back. She reminded me of movies about domestic abusers or gangsters, and I had just insulted her in front of 20 other kids. Not everyone laughed when I called her lousy, but enough did. And when you're a kid and you've been humiliated like that, it seems like everyone is laughing at you. I tried to apologize. I really did, but she wouldn't hear it. "I'm going to get you back," she growled before we got on the bus. She sat in the back. I sat as close to the front as I could and tried to read a book with the shadow of that promise hanging over my head, scared out of my mind. At least until we got there and I stepped out into the sunlight and actually saw Rovesford up close and in the flesh. And the world narrowed down to just that for a little while. You see, Emil Rovesford was a stage musician turned architect who spent 15 years of his life planning and constructing a place that would incorporate all the different kinds of architecture that he'd seen on his trips around the world. And the result was chaos that you could touch and inhabit, like an I Spy book with buildings or a living 3D collage. From above, the whole mess looked like a giant protozoa, maybe a very lopsided star, bloated and prickly on one side, stretched like taffy on the other. Each section was a jumble. There were brick and stone, metal and glass and wood. And there were domes and colonnades, bays and belfries, gables and eaves, Shion-zukuri and Old Gothic, Colonial and Victorian and Grecan, all welded together. I could have stared forever, trying to pick out every little detail, but Miss Dandridge only gave us about a minute before most of the rest of my class ran out of attention span. We spilled into the northern lobby, which was cool and quiet and more or less what I'd imagined a swanky hotel to be like. Red carpeting, a high barrel vault roof, white pillars, clusters of couches, and a tour guide waiting to show us around. Her name was Annie, and she was great. I remember her being a carefree, laid-back college chick who took the job because she honestly thought it was interesting. The hotel's layout was so chaotic it required a bunch of laminated maps to navigate, but Annie had definitely been there for a while because she never so much as looked at any of them. She took us from room to room and laid everything out. If there was a script that she was supposed to go by, she probably chucked it right in the trash after the first few read-throughs because she added so much history and so many weird bits of trivia, stuff even I didn't know about, and I thought I'd researched it all pretty well. There were a few things I knew, like how the planning stage took 5 years because Rovesford kept going to new places, falling in love with new bits of architecture, and then deciding to add them in, or how he passed over his oldest son and gave his daughter the stewardship of the place and his fortune, which in the 19th century was a pretty big deal, caused a huge scandal. It wasn't until we got to the game room that I actually heard something that I hadn't before. There we all were, in the middle of this huge comma-shaped room with a red shag and oak paneling, trying to keep out of the way of the construction guys who are packing up the musty old mod furniture and the old arcade machines. When in the middle of telling us about how they were going to refurbish the room, Louise put her hand up and asked, "Are you guys going to open up the Blue Wing?" Behind us there were two people, a construction guy and a woman in a business suit. Both were arguing quietly, and when they heard her ask that, Louise wasn't very soft-spoken. They turned around and glared at her. She glared right back and cocked her chin defiantly. I don't think Annie noticed any of that, though. She just laughed and told us the whole wing was going to stay closed up, and that it was eventually going to be torn down from the rest of the building. She asked, "Where'd you hear about the Blue Wing?" Louise said, "On the internet. They had an article on Ogrish." Then a boy asked what the Blue Wing was, and I saw the mischief come alive in Annie's eyes. She looked around, then lowered her voice and said, "What you guys don't know? The last owner of this hotel was a murderer." That was my introduction to Grace Rovesford, the last of that family line and the one who gave the place its reputation. Grace was born at the tail end of the 40s, raised by two parents who had died right next to her in a car crash one evening in 1953. They'd taken a back road in Nevada and swerved to avoid a coyote. Grace was pinned to the dash for 13 hours before help came. Annie said that she ended up locked in an asylum for a decade afterwards and came out worse off than she had been when she was thrown in. But I did some research, and she was actually admitted to a highly regarded naturalistic retreat on the outskirts of California, and it was only for a year. There's not much about her I could find in the years before she fully took over the inn, but I think the rest of Annie's story turned out pretty much true. She became a minor celebrity in the hippie community in the early 60s, wrote a whole bunch of papers on everything from homeopathy to astral projection, and published a book of poetry called To Dance in Dreamland, to Scorn the Reaper. In 65, she actually took charge of the hotel and added her own flair, taking what she'd loved about San Francisco and transplanting as much of it as she could. If you look at the pictures from the time, every room looks like a blacklight poster with mod furniture, space-age appliances to top it all off. A lot of the old clientele hated it. They thought it looked like, and I quote, a sleazy head shop. But the hotel had been in a slouch by then, and there weren't many of these people left. The new look actually worked, and for 4 years it was as lively as it had ever been when it was first opened. Tourists loved the new novelty, and the hippies loved that it was a place meant for them, overseen by one of them. Grace used to come down and greet her guests at breakfast. People said that she had a smile like a slice of sunshine. She could make you feel happier just by being in her presence. At night, she and some of her old commune who had set up shop there would sing and get high, and she'd talk about her ideas and the things that she'd seen in her dreams. 4 years of prosperity. 4 years of peace. And then it all came crashing down. Grace got sick. Very sick. She started keeping to herself more and more. Her lungs began to shut down, and so there was no more singing. Did you know that there was a ballad written about her last year's? It's called The Silence Comes to Stay, and that's what it was like, apparently. People left. The mood was gone. Grace moved from her room on the northwest spire to a wing her mother had added on. She had her friends paint the walls and ceiling blue, and then she locked herself away with only a couple of people closest to her. She hired a manager to run things, and she stayed where she was. People asked after her health and were told that she was, quote, engaged in a healing contemple. Things evened out for a while. Some people even said they could hear her singing some nights. And then a man named Jasper Arnott went missing. His wife said he'd gotten up in the middle of the night and hadn't come back. She looked, and when she couldn't find anything, she got the staff to look with her. The search went on for hours, and then a maid found Arnott laying in the eastern garden, his bathrobe covered in blood, and his head missing. The police never found the head or the weapon that did it, but they did find Grace's prints on the bathrobe. All of her friends went peacefully, and so did she. She died of cancer in December 1969, a month before her trial. The investigations also implicated her in a dozen other missing persons cases, but nothing ever came of it. Annie didn't tell it quite like that. She shortened it, added something about garden shears, for effect, and it worked, too. I was scared out of my mind. Not even Mrs. Dandridge announcing that we were going to have a pizza night made me feel any better. We ran around and played where we were allowed. I sat by an empty koi pond and watched the little vents bubble away. I crossed bridges, ducked through trap doors, used slides sculpted to look like dolphins leaping from the water. I even found a narrow passage hidden behind a suit of armor, just like in the Hardy Boys. I wandered it for a bit before I realized that I had gone farther than I was supposed to. I was halfway back when I heard two people talking in hushed, angry tones, a man and a woman. You need to find out who's doing this. I don't care how. We don't know. It just keeps getting broken. We seal it up. Next day, it's all in pieces on the floor. In any other situation, I might have listened in, but as it stood with the anxiety rolling around inside my stomach, the idea of hearing an argument, and an adult argument at that, made me feel like a mouse in front of a hurricane. When I managed to rejoin the pack, it was time for pizza and soda and movies in the viewing room. By the end of it, I had a gut full of junk food and a head full of worries and fuzz. We were split up into littler groups and led to our bedrooms for the night. I think I was probably asleep before I even hit the bed. I wasn't asleep for long, though, which I should have expected given the circumstances. I had a horrible nightmare about being trapped in a dark, close space, hearing teeth scraping over something hard. I woke up all at once in a bed that wasn't mine, in a dark room I didn't know. Things felt so unreal and slow and heavy, and all I could think was, I need to get out of here. I don't remember leaving the room or what hallways I went down. I only came to my senses when I slammed into someone's back. I fell on my rear and the other person gasped, stumbled, and spun around. It was Louise. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed. Those big hands of hers closed into fists. For an instant, I saw her knuckles straining white against her skin, and I could almost feel them digging into my cheek or busting my nose. Then she took a step towards me, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could, and she followed. Neither of us noticed the change in wallpaper from cream to faded orange and purple, or the plastic sheets over everything, the white bucket stacked in one nook, the big industrial vacuums humped up against the wall, or the fresh shards of plaster on the floor. All I could register was an open door, and the hallway was wide and dark like a throat. Every door was shut, and dust puffed under my sneakers with every step I took. I made it to the end of the hall, to one last door before Louise grabbed the back of my shirt and threw me into the wall. Then she was in my face. Her eyes gleamed in the low light. "You made him laugh at me, you little freak," she hissed. Her breath was cold and smelled like cola. I tried to explain myself, but she shoved me back into the wall and hit me hard enough to make my teeth click together. It tasted blood. My guts churned and I prepared for more, but Louise had backed off. She looked at me, at the blood, with wide eyes like she'd never seen it before. Then she looked at her hand. She told me later that had been the first time she'd hurt someone bad enough to make them bleed, and that it made something click in her mind. It became real to her, she said. There was silence between us. I still cowered. Louise still looked at me like I was about to keel over and die right there, but there was stillness. I could breathe. She could think properly. And that's when we noticed the music. I say noticed and not heard because it sounded like it had been playing ever since before we'd even gone down the hallway, but I don't know why. It sounded like music from a long time ago, fluty and rambling and soft. It made me think of people with wooden flutes, letting their music wind down under doorways and through grassy meadows. It's music of dark forests, standing stones, deserts that never ended, and obscure islands with ancient palaces, temples made of marble. It was so weird that we had to turn around, and when we did, we saw that the door was gone, vanished like it had never been installed in the first place. Beyond it was a big room with a low ceiling. There were couches and bare mattresses and rugs on the floor and an old censer hanging from an IV stand. There was light coming from it, cold, pale, and blue. There was someone in there. We could hear them stepping and hopping softly but ceaselessly, giggling under their breath. We couldn't see anyone. Neither of us made a sound. We didn't know what we were seeing, not really, but we both knew that we were seeing something that we weren't supposed to see. I took a step back. Louise did too. Something was wrong with the light. It made the patterns in the rugs gape like black holes, and if you looked at it too long, you felt like it wasn't actually light at all. Then something creaked to our right. We turned and saw that another door had vanished. It was dark outside, but the light showed us enough. There was someone in the room, someone who was coming out. I saw the hands first, flung out in front of it, groping blindly with fat, black fingers, then arms that jerked and twitched. And then the rest. A man was leaving his room, a man in stained boxers and skin the color of standing water, dripping, swollen with bite marks all over. He didn't have a head. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My reality was drawing into a single point. Things were too clear, too real. I was watching a headless, rotting corpse feel its way towards me, hands grasping at air, the torn flesh of its neck jutting as silent as the light we were standing in. And then Louise screamed, and we were running. I heard its feet then, taking quick, stumbling steps. He knew where we were now. My heart was pounding so loud, I almost didn't notice how the music had turned sour. The hallway stretched on and on. There was no more dust or cobwebs. The doors were vanishing 2 by 2, and the light revealing the deep, cold blues of the walls and ceiling had been painted in blue like Saturn or somewhere far off. Louise reached the exit first and slammed into it. It wasn't locked. She tumbled out into the red carpet and plaster chunks. I don't know why I did it, but just before my body passed through, I looked back. And if Louise hadn't caught me by the hand and dragged me behind her, I don't really know how to articulate it, but I think she saved my life. We ran until we saw lights on under doors, normal ones. One of Louise's friends heard us and opened the door, and when she saw us in good light, she called for grown-ups. The last thing I really remember for a while was hearing Louise asking if I was okay. I really wasn't. Apparently, Louise told the adults what we'd seen. I was in no state to say anything, so I couldn't corroborate her story, but it still got people talking. I saw the news story later once I was better. The police had come. This time they'd found something. They'd found 15 heads, wrapped in duct tape, set behind the walls of the Blue Wing. There were some arrests. I think it was a little too late. Louise asked what I'd seen when I looked back. Once, years later, at a party, where she was too drunk to stop herself from asking, and I was too drunk to lie. I told her. And now I'll tell you. The room had snuck up behind us while our backs were turned, like a tiger. It shortened the whole length of the hall until it was 2 feet from the exit. And I saw everything. They were dancing in a circle, some in pajamas, some in bathrobes, some in less. All dead, all headless. Split heels beat the floor, maggots fell from them and disappeared into the patterns on the rugs. They lurched and pirouetted. They spun while the music played. It had really spoiled by then. It sounded bad, worse than I can really explain, just old and greedy. It pressed into my ears like soft fingers. It tugged at my skin. Then the crowd parted a little, and I saw someone at the center of the circle playing a flute. Grace? Probably. I can't even describe what she'd swelled up and stretched out into. They've torn the Blue Wing down. The rest of the hotel is fine. It's still running. Sometimes I browse the internet, I look for new sightings, but there hasn't been anything. All's quiet there, which is good. Louise wrote a book called The Scratchings and Mutterings, The Haunted Hotels of New England. If you're reading this, I hope you're doing well, and I'm sorry I called you lousy. It really was an accident.